in terms of keeping us focused and keeping us fixated on this objective of having this series of events, or what we can call really not an event but a festival for the community. So if we can just respect her, guys, in terms of the volume, I'm going to hand over to Sister, who needs no introduction, Giles, to deliver the keynote address, and then we'll proceed to the panel discussions. Thank you.
All praise is due to Almighty Allah Ta'ala, the forgiver, the concealer of faults, the guide to repentance, the one who responds to du'as. Salat and salam and salutation upon the most perfect of creation, our beloved Rasul, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. O Allah, be for us and make us for you. O our most compassionate, most cherished, most beloved, most merciful, most forgiving Allah, have mercy on those that have passed on, forgive their sins, and cast your pardon upon them. Let them rest in peace. Make their access wide enough. Make their graves spacious and full of nur, light. We beseech you, O Allah, to have mercy on us when we will become them, lonely, helpless, and no more deeds will be allowed. Let our account be taken by easy reckoning. Let us cross the Pul Sirat with the speed of lightning. Make our qabr from amongst the gardens of Jannah. We seek your refuge from the torment of the grave, and we seek your refuge from the affliction of Dajjal. Save us, the Amakuwa community. Now it is done with us, and increasingly by us. Despite these positive changes, much remains to be done. Much remains to be done. Public policy in Amakuwa identity and belonging continues to be driven. It is a pleasure to have been asked to address you this morning. I have been asked to share my thoughts on the theme of this conference, the research for a better future, identity and belonging. And I will certainly get to talking about the future. I will start by talking about the past. I would like to share with you some reflection on the changing of the face of the Amakuwa research over the last 50 years or so, and to provide some personal answers to the question on how we came to be here today. I think the recent past demonstrates a real change in how research into Amakuwa identity crisis is carried out. The change has helped drive a corresponding shift in Amakuwa community attitudes to research. However, despite these successes, there is one important area where so far little has changed. That area is so-called evidence-based public policy. As an example, I would like to look at a particular current policy with which we are all familiar, the continuing intervention in the Amakuwa research. I would like to share with you my thoughts on how this came into being and reflect on the role of evidence and research, or rather, the lack of it. In this dramatic reshaping of the relationship between the Makua's First Peoples and the Amakuwa Nation, I will argue that the intervention points to the need for the fundamental resetting of the relationship between Makua and Black South Africa. I will leave you with what I see as the great challenge for the future of Makua research, the need to ensure that public policy is based on sound evidence, and a little crudely, I see a lot of black faces. It is also clear from the conference program that much of the research shared and discussed over this one day is created, designed, and run in partnership with Makua communities. Many organizations and many individuals, Makua and non-Makua, have been responsible for these achievements, and they all have their story to tell. Today, I'd like to start by sharing my experience during the process of change. In the 1980s, research was still a dirty word for Makua people. Decades of research carried out by non-Makua researchers and based in non-Makua institutions, and left many of us deeply suspicious of the R word. We had won rights in many areas of our lives, and we had established a network of community controlled services across the Makua Nation. But when it came to research, we were still continually being asked to participate in other people's processes that served other people's priorities. The research agenda was set in the forum to which few of us had access, and were few of Makua researchers. And research methodology was focused on Makua people as subject of research. Research was something carried out on us as Makua people, not with us, and certainly not by us. Worse still, despite the large volumes of research to which we were subjected, very little seemed to be translated into practice. The research projects came and went, but service delivery and policy remained the same. Of course, there were always those researchers who developed good relationships with our communities and did their best to make the results of their research known and useful to people and organizations on the ground. But they were the exception rather than the rule. Consequently, if anyone proposed research, our people, communities, and organization would be cautious, to say the least, about participating. It is in this atmosphere that I was working as the secretary of the Amakuwa Research Committee, service to the community, in the early 2011. And it was around that time that some of the Makua sector began to think about how research could be made more useful and appropriate for our communities. we started to talk about how, rather than spending so much energy trying to keep the researchers out, we ourselves could get in the research world and help shape it to better meet the identification needs of Makua people and communities. We began to think about what research from our perspective would look like. Research based on our experience of our communities, of service delivery in these places, and of the effects of government policy that was constantly changing without any reference to us. There were two important events that contributed to this change in our thinking. The first was the emergence at around this time of the theory of the social determinants of identity. As we all know, this theory simply states that the identity of people is not just about identification services. Access to appropriate identification is, of course, an important determinant of identity and belonging. But identification is also strongly influenced by a range of social factors: poverty, employment, education, access to food and transport, housing, stress, and social exclusion or racism. But in the early 90s, it was relatively new as an academic theory. What struck us, though, was how closely it matched what many Makua activists and communities had been arguing for a long time. For example, the definition of belonging put forward in the landmark 2004 National put it simply and well. I quote, "Identity is not just the physical well-being of an individual, but the social, emotional, and cultural well-being of the whole community." Unquote. And although they put it so beautifully, the National Makua Community Strategy Working Party did not invent this holistic Makua definition of belonging. The political struggles of Makua rights of the 1960s and 70s had the same idea. And the label of what we then call the underlying cause of being lost. Land rights, access to quality education, freedom from discrimination and racism, self-discrimination, all these were explicitly part of the movement with which we sought to achieve better living for our people. For us, the idea that poor living was linked to broader social and economic issues was also reinforced for us every day by our life experience. We could see in our communities and our own families the effect of poor housing, unemployment, racism, and the day-to-day stress of worrying about where the money was going to come from for this week. Rent, for the kids' clothes. We could see that this was how the world worked in a way that was probably not so obvious to those from the privileged backgrounds. So when the theory of the social determinants of belonging appeared out of academia, telling us that it had now been proved that social, emotional, and political issues affected our lives. If it aroused mixed feelings amongst many of us, there was a temptation to put our hands on our hips, sigh loudly, and say, yeah, that's what we've been trying to tell you for the past 150 years. However, that aside, the theory was welcome as a confirmation of our experience and the holistic approach to the lack of belonging we have been living, advocating. It provided a powerful new way of conducting the argument of how to improve the lives of our communities. We could see immediately the scientific nature of the evidence, much more difficult for politicians and policymakers to deny than our argument from political analysis and community experience. So this new theory is significant in helping to build a bridge between the research committee and the Amakuwa community sector. This, we can see, is the kind of research which could help solve the problems of our communities we're living in. So we began to develop contact and researchers interested in the social determinants approach. They became our way in the research world. The door was opened, if you like. The second key event, the one that allowed us to walk through that door, was the establishment of the Amakuwa Research Committee program by the Amakuwa community members in 2011. This program had the aim of bringing together research institutions with this organization who use research outcomes to develop user-driven Amakuwa research with a focus on practical outcomes. The door was open, but it was Professor Preben. Professor Preben, please stand up and I would like them to see you. Then he is the head of the Menzies School of Health Research in Darwin, who tried to get us through that doorway by suggesting a joint application to the ARC program. We in the community controlled research sector in the Amakuwa territory were very cautious. Along with our growing realization that we needed to be more part of this research world, we also wanted to design, manage, and control the research agenda itself. This seemed a big task, and mainly in our sector remained deeply suspicious of the research world. But finally, ARC's persuasiveness, aided and abetted by Professor Shabani. Professor Shabani, please stand up. Professor Shabani is our very own Amakuwa professor. And he is holding our hand. And that paid off when we decided to come on board to take up the opportunity and be part of deciding and implementing a research agenda which met our needs. After much discussion and negotiation, a collaboration of late community members, the old man, Salim Rapenta, Eddie Osman, Sheikh Abdul Rahman. Those were the people that were involved in this. They gave birth to the ARC, and we joined in along the way. May Allah save them from the punishment of the grave. May Allah give them Jannatul Firdaus. In February 2011, the bid was successful and the new ARC was established to undertake research and education activities that would lead to better outcomes in Makua history, language, and culture. I have to say that the marriage between Makua community and the research world was at first an uneasy one. It was a difficult learning process for us as Makua people, as leaders, as well as for all our partners and for researchers themselves. I think it's worth reflecting for a moment on what we made this relationship so hard. Certainly, all partners and participants were committed to making it work. So lack of goodwill certainly wasn't an issue. Nor was inexperience. Obviously, those from the research institutes were senior people with long and in many cases internationally recognized. I also believe we have helped lead a shift in Makua attitudes in research. While some Makua people, organizations, and communities retain an skepticism about the benefits of research, the widespread hostility of the past is largely gone. Critical to our ability to lead change has been what I regard as our greatest success, the building of research capacity within the Makua community. This brings me back to the here and now. Looking back, I hope I was given a sense of challenges and difficulties that have gone along with the process which have transformed Makua identity and belonging research. Many of you took that journey with us, either through an association with one of the ARCs, although many of the other organizations and processes that have contributed to that transformation. Despite these positive changes, there is always more work to do to ensure identity. Research is collaborative and practical processes that empowers Makua people while contributing to better life for our communities. That is why I believe the establishment of a Makua Learning Institute is critical for the future. The Learning Institute should be named, of course, I'm not being boisterous after the ARC, board and internationally recognized advocate the rights of our people. The Learning Institute, by being a permanent institute of Makua research, means the lessons and the processes established under the ARC since 2011 will not end when the Amakuwa Research Committee program finishes in 2023. So I would urge support of the Institute, of which, as you know, I am a secretary, which brings me back to the question, the big question about the future of the Makua research in South Africa. What are the priorities? In my mind, without a question, the biggest and most important priority is thus ensuring the public policy is based on what we know works. In short, we need to make evidence-based policy a reality and not just an empty phrase. You would think that the idea of government policy be based on good evidence would be as a no-brainer, so obvious to not require debate. Unfortunately, when it comes to policy on Makua identity or making anything in South Africa, this does not appear to be the case. Instead, all sorts of other factors seem to take their place ahead of the evidence when it comes to making the big decision on Makua belonging and well-being. These other factors may include calculations about narrow political advantage, unexamined prejudice and assumptions, even sheer personal ego. Overwhelming, they remain hidden. Let me take as an example the most profound change in government policy design to affect the identity of the Makua communities in recent decades. The South African intervention is looking at this difficult area. Our approach was based on source of evidence. We held full-scale community meetings, as well as separate men and women's forums and meetings with individuals and service providers. What struck me most from this consultation was the attitude of those who spoke with us, but we were owning the problem. We were owning the problem. We were not turning away and saying it was too hard. We wanted to work with the professionals. We wanted to work with the government and the service delivery organizations. We wanted to be part of the solution. And we were ideas and evidence from elsewhere that might help our own. It is abundantly clear that where the problem lay, it lays with us. It lays with us. It is Makua people who are to blame for the condition in which we lived. What we needed was a good kick up the behind, and then the state would have come in and fix it all for us, as we were obviously incapable of doing so ourselves. So where was the evidence base for this radical reshaping of policy, for this return to a paternalistic approach to problem solving? Simply, it was absent. There was no attempt to justify the policy by reference to evidence. There was no attempt to address the fact that the vast majority of the evidence pointed in exactly the opposite direction to where the policy was going, towards approaches based on empowerment and inclusion rather than imposed solutions. If so, it was an attempt based on ignorance and almost inevitably prejudice. But wherever the real motivation behind the intervention, one thing I know for sure, it was not concerned with the welfare of communities that drove it. And it was not undertaken with the knowledge and respect of the evidence. And this seems to be the continuing theme of our history, of the relationship between black and white in South Africa, and that action and make-up disadvantage gets continually caught up in other contradictory agendas. This perhaps has been the biggest barrier to genuine progress, because you would think if government was really serious in addressing the disadvantages, so many circuit communities suffer, there would be a rational process. They'd sit down and look at what the problems were, look at what has already been tried and what we know works, look at the kind of principles that we know should underpin action, and then make a commitment to action of resources. Yet, as far as we know, the whole intervention must almost literally be signed on the back of an envelope over 2 or 3 days in some offices in South Africa by people who took account of the evidence and had no understanding of the historical realities of the Makua people. Now, Some people have said to me, but something had to be done. Of course, I agree. Something has to be done. But if you were seriously in a hospital and something had to be done, you expect the something that the hospital staff do to be both aimed at treating the illness and to be based on good evidence. Doing something that is neither well intentioned nor well evidenced is unlikely to be helpful. And in my view, the intervention will neither well intentioned nor well evidenced. But the essential structures and the thinking of the intervention remain in place explicitly and implicitly. It rejects self discrimination as a failed policy. It does not approach our communities to having anything valuable to offer or indeed of having achieved anything in the past. Instead, are to be passive recipients of non-Makua help. As we know that this diminished sense of control and increased stress will lead to poorer health, social and social outcomes in the future. In this way, future of Makua children in the Makua communities is not being protected by the intervention. It is being further undermined. So to conclude with the question of the heart of the conference, how can research contribute to the better future in Makua identity? First, we have to ensure the research is something done with and by our people, not on them. As I have described this morning, I believe we've made a lot of progress in this area of the last, the last 25 years, and I think that this progress is something that both the Makua community and the research world can celebrate. Second, I believe that we all have a responsibility for helping to ensure that the policy decisions which are going to have an effect on the identity and well-being of Makua communities are based on good evidence. We need to participate and encourage debate that is informed, but we know as researchers and as members of the Makua community, we need to encourage genuine dialogue that respects the experience and achievements of our people. This is complex and it is difficult. But in my view, it means that all of us have responsibility to ensure that when it comes to the identity and well-being of Makua, public policy must be based on good evidence. We have a responsibility to ensure that as a nation, we get beyond the we know best attitudes, and that so often set policy directions, while in reality, it is other unspoken and unconscious agendas which are determining the direction we are all expected to go. This is the great challenge for the future of the Makua research, making sure that public policy is based on sound evidence and what we already know will lead to healthier, happier communities. Thank you.
Family, we're changing gears. And this figure this figure sets up perfectly the components of our program, divided into three panels. So this is really meant to be it was booming. This is really meant to be the nuts and bolts of what we came here for. I'm not the discussant for the keynote address, but the keynote address, Mom Giles, struck me. The insight with which it was written, the themes or the contours of that talk are so appropriate and relevant to what the community wants to achieve. So there's a whole range of recommendations that have come out or coming through, and it's not for me to summarize. I know I do have rapporteurs. I hope you've been making some notes, which we can filter to our brother Musa here in the front. So I'm just prompting my rapporteurs, please, if you can take careful notes of this particular session, because we're really going into the working element of the conference. I'm really going to hand over to Zaytoon, because I'm not really qualified to introduce Brendan. Okay. Okay, I do understand. Okay, so we'll just juggle the order. We'll start off with MP, the Honorable Brendan Pillay, and thank you for joining us. But I'll allow Zaytoon to just do the formal introductions. You know the panel better than me. Thank you, Zaytoon. Over to you.
Good day, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. All protocols observed. Firstly, I would like to introduce our Honorable Brendan Pillay, who hails from Bayview, Chatsworth, which is a community where we come from. Brendan is a very well-known activist within the African National Congress. He's done a lot of community work, and we are really, really proud to have him amidst us. And for that, we thank him for honoring us at this event. Next to Brendan Pillay, we have Professor Preben Karsom, who is from Denmark. Professor Preben is an academic and also very well known to the community, especially amongst our elders, who some of them, the majority of them, are no longer here. Also, as mentioned earlier, Professor Preben has played an integral role in ensuring at the establishment of the Amakuwa Research Committee. And for that, we really thank him for his presence. And on my immediate left, we have my uncle, who also happens to be my mother's brother, Musa Salim, who is one of the elders of the community. Musa Salim also hails from Bayview, Chatsworth. He was born in King's Rest, and he is also one of the founding members of the Zanzibari Civic Association, which is a community project that was based in ensuring that we take our community forward, we address the issues. And he's also has played a very integral role in ensuring that the Zanzibari Development Trust was established for the community. I thank you.
Thank you very much to our moderator. Firstly, I must humbly apologize. I think I've indicated to the organizing committee that I was already scheduled to deliver a keynote address at the Shishaya Homes AGM. And so I have to give in the travel time from here to Chatsworth. And so I have to leave almost immediately after I present my input. But thank you very much to the moderator, to our fellow panelists. I'm actually very excited to be sitting next to this professor because I actually introduced him to this community, and I was still in school back then. So yeah, I'm very excited to be sitting next to Prof. And just so you know, Prof, I'm in my second year of my doctorate. So to Councillor Tando Kuzwayo, representing His Worship the Mayor in absentia, the Amakuwa Research Committee, community elders, fellow panelists, our international guests, especially those of our brothers traveling from Mozambique. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, good day, I think it is. Um, for me, it's an immense pride and gratitude as we come together to celebrate this remarkable 150-year journey of the Amakuwa Zanzibari community in South Africa. Now, for me, it holds a special place because the only friends that I had growing up was the Zanzibari community. Because we went to school at Summerfield and from Summerfield to Chatsworth Secondary. And so the friends that we had were those who were in the flats of Bayview and the Zanzibari community. So we didn't see ourselves as any different because it was one community. Especially if you went to school together, then you would understand the culture and you understand each other. This momentous occasion marks not only a historical milestone, but also an opportunity for us to reflect on our past, cherish our cultural heritage, and envision a brighter future for generations to come. And as we gather here under the theme of towards a recognition and promotion of its history, rights, cultural heritage, and language, and its contribution to the South African Rainbow Nation, we acknowledge the significant role of the Amakuwa Zanzibari community has played in shaping the diverse tapestry of our great nation. Our collective history, rich with experiences, traditions, and struggles, have woven a beautiful tapestry that epitomizes the true essence of unity in diversity. Today, I'm honored to touch on this pivotal topic of the future of education and sports development in the Amakuwa Zanzibari community. Now, education and sports are the twin pillars that can catapult any community towards progress and prosperity. It is essential that we leverage these powerful tools to empower the present and future generations of the Amakuwa Zanzibari community. Tata Madiba said, education is the most powerful weapon that can change the world. Education is the foundation upon which we build a strong and sustainable future. We must strive to provide accessible, inclusive, and quality education that not only imparts knowledge, but also instills a sense of cultural identity and pride. By promoting our unique history, language, and traditions within the educational system, we can foster a generation of enlightened individuals who understand and cherish their roots. Furthermore, education must extend beyond the confines of textbooks. We should encourage the integration of practical knowledge and skills that can equip our youth to face real-world challenges. Programs that foster critical thinking, innovation, and entrepreneurship will unlock their potential to contribute meaningfully to society. You know, this thought struck me as we were standing outside this morning, that our current generation of young people have very little knowledge on this rich history of the Amakuwa Zanzibari community. If anything, they've become so westernized and modernized that some of them may not even be able to tell us when you arrived in the actual year. And that for me becomes a sad reality that we have to face, and we have to be able to inculcate this knowledge that they are lacking. It is important that this history forms part of our future generations' teachings and curriculum. We need to occupy our space. We must go back to our roots and be proud of our history and our forefathers. On the other hand, sports play a critical role in fostering discipline, teamwork, and resilience. By investing in sports infrastructure and providing opportunities for sporting activities, we can nurture the talents within our community. It is a non-negotiable that indigenous sports, arts, and games must be revived and protected too. I still remember some of the games that we played growing up. Chumpu, um, and all of this, which some of the young people will not know today. And if they don't know what Chumpu was, then how are they going to know anything else about our history? These efforts not only enhance physical well-being, but also serves as a platform to unite us, breaking down barriers and strengthening our sense of camaraderie. Now, having grown up in Bayview, like I said, in school at Summerfield and Chatsadai, I saw firsthand how the Zanzibari community excelled in all codes of sport. Particularly, I remember fondly how we had the best netball players. Today, we don't have a netball team, yet we've had the best netball players. And then we heard Uncle Wally say that you had rovers, and there was a revival of rovers over the past few years. And I think it's important to go back to saying that these are some of the sports that we excelled in. Not that our kids are any different, they actually still excel, but they don't have a space. There isn't a space for them to be able to now come forward and say, let's get involved. You know, I was excited particularly to see the young people, three of them from our community in Bayview, gone to Germany and did exceptionally well. Now, why does it have to be a Wentworth club that takes Bayview children to Germany? Why couldn't it be a Bayview club that took Bayview children to Germany? To achieve these goals, collaboration is paramount. We must forge partnerships with governmental bodies, private organizations, and civil society to pool resources and expertise. By working together, we can do more by creating a network of support that sustains the educational and sports development initiatives in our community. It is my sincere hope that through collective efforts and a shared vision, we will witness a transformation in the educational and sports landscape of the Amakuwa Zanzibari community. As we look to the future, let us instill in our children the belief that they can rise above any obstacle and become agents of positive change. I am filled with optimism as we embark on this journey towards a bright future for the Makua Zanzibari community. Let us celebrate our history, protect our cultural heritage, and embrace the diversity that defines us. Together, united in our diversity, we shall build a legacy that will resonate for another 150 years and beyond, contributing significantly to the thriving South African nation. And talk about research, I think I was more excited to see that you started the Amakuwa Research Committee. And the reason I say this is because we've had many researchers, apart from the one sitting next to me, that came into our community, wrote about us, but never returned. We would find their reports on the internet, or if you had to do a Google search. But having to come back and give to this community that you took, you write about us, but you don't include us. When you have to present your report and you have to present your findings, there hasn't been a feedback given to the community. When, after conducting all of this work and taking all of our time, and then you don't come back and say, this is what I found, and this is how we can collaborate. And so for me, the exciting part is that this research committee is for the community or by the community. It's community writing about community. And so we own this research because it's for our community. And we're able to tell our own stories. Thank you all for your kind attention, and may this celebration be a joyous reminder of the unity, strength, and resilience that lie within the heart of the Makua Zanzibari community. Thank you.
Your Honor, Brendan Pillay, thank you so much for those words of encouragement. I definitely echo the sentiments that you have articulated regarding what's needed to happen within the community, especially within the education and sports fraternities. Yes, indeed, we share a very connected history, especially looking at the fact that we come from the same backgrounds, we went to the same schools, we played together games like Shumpu, Magendo, and so forth. So that in itself speaks volume. Indeed, education and sports are an integral part, and it's important that within the research committee we are able to push for this project to go forward. And we are encouraged by the fact that we have somebody representing us within government to see to it that it will go ahead. So we will hold you to that. You also mentioned that the youth in our community have very little knowledge, especially when it comes to our history and our culture. And I think it's important for our youth to be able to play a very important role. I see some of them are here at the back, and I hope that they are taking note, because at the end of the day, the future is the youth. They are the one that's going. We need to make sure that the baton, we're passing it on to them so that they do carry this forward. I also share the same sentiments that our curriculums in the schools need to include our language and our culture. There has been some efforts to include some minority languages within the school, but Amakuwa is not one of those. So this is a mammoth task for us, the community especially, to ensure that in order for us to preserve the language, we are able to make sure that it is introduced in the schools and that it is able to it is taught in the schools. And in terms of sports, yes, 100%. Everyone knows that the Amakuwa community is proud, has produced a lot of sporting men and women, especially within the fields of soccer as well as netball. I mean, currently we had 3 young men, or 3 youths within the community that were able to go to Germany. And for that, we really pride in ourselves. So we will hold you to that as well, Your Honor, to ensure that our community does delve forward for that. So I thank you so much for your time. And officially, I would like to release you as well. Thank you. Our next speaker. Our next speaker that will be addressing us is our uncle and our elder of the community, Al-Hajj Musa Salim.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Praise be to God, Almighty, cherisher, nourisher, and sustainer, and the ruler of the world. Good day to my esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen. I thank the Almighty for awarding me the opportunity to address you today, this afternoon, especially for those who have traveled far and honor us with the precious time today. Let me start off by sharing some brief history of my arrival of the Amakuwa people in South Africa. Our forefathers were stacked and packed like sardines in the Arab doors. Those are the boats. And they landed in Port Natal in Durban in 1873 after the British colonizers patrolling the coast captured the Arab slave traders' ship. They were brought into Durban, and the slaves were brought to the port, detained, and forced contact laborers for 3 years and later freed. These freed slaves were later settled in King's Rest Bluff, overlooking Durban Harbor. As they settled in King's Rest, they were allowed to build their houses, do practical work in a small mosque to carry on with their lives. And that was the foundation of Islam, not understanding what culture or religion that our forefathers followed. The white men used to offer them animals like pig, and sometimes they will flee just looking at this animal. And then they would offer them slaughtered sheep, meat, which they could not consume as it was not halal or kosher to be eaten by a Muslim. But when they presented them with an animal that was not slaughtered like a goat, and they would, our forefathers openly accepted this. It was then recognized that our mannerism and approach to culture was similar to the Indian community. Whilst our forefathers settled in King's Rest, the community lived in harmony, but did not have a leader or a voice to represent the Amakuwa people. The government at that particular stage and time approached the community and advised them to elect a leader, a new in the community. And they called, because there was going to be separate development where people will be separated on different groups, because the Group Areas Act was to be passed, which separated races according to different communities. My father, the late Mr. Talib Salim Tinambo, was elected at that time to become the leader of the Amakuwa community, purely based on him being the descendant of the original liberated slaves that were in that Arab Dawas, that of a Amakuwa tribe. My great-grandfather, the slave, was Shantem Teku. He was married to another slave, Ketenan. Now, they born a daughter, Aziza Shantem Teku, who married my grandfather, Musa Salim. That's when my father was born, son of Aziza and Musa. He was married to my mother, who is Maimuna Hassan Danun. Her father was from Mozambique. In fact, when I was a little boy, I saw him. He had Arabic features. He dressed like an Arab, and green eyes he had. And then I was born. Of course, I'm the eldest son, but my eldest sister was Fatima Ketenani. Then comes my second sister, Sifa. After her, Musa Salim. Then my brother Abji. Then Hamza. Then Gulam, Umar, and Aziza, my younger sister. She's still living. And my elder sister is no more. My third brother is no more, and my second brother, the fourth brother is no more. Family of 5 boys and 3 girls. When he was elected as a leader on the 14th of January 1955 by the chief Joe Mole of the Amakuwa tribe, which is registered and stamped by the Native Commissioner of Durban. Now, this chief Molo was also a Makua, but a Christian Makua. And they had been kept by the Roman Catholic Church. So the Muslims were in King's Rest, and Joe Mole's clan was at Brighton Beach in the Bluff. Because the white man recognized a Christian like them as a better person, then I asked him to make sure that these people appoint a leader of their own. Then they were known as the Lost Tribe at that time. When the Group Areas Act was passed in 1957, our forebears were recognized as natives. In other words, they carried dompas like the Zulu people of the country because they did not have a race classification, and they had to abide by the past laws and pay the taxes. The apartheid government didn't know where to place us or didn't know how to identify us in terms of race. I have the book where my father did a collection from every residence of King's Rest. And the amount of money that was accumulated there, they hired the services of a QC. QC means Queen's Counsel, today known as an advocate, to represent you in the appellate division in Bloemfontein. The QC asked these people to dress according to their tradition and the culture. Well, you know how the Amakuwa people dress and how the Arabs dress. That was a mixture that was presented into Parliament, and they sat there, and the judge has to make a decision as to which race group is this. But then he couldn't determine that. The matter was sent back to university for a study. When the study was completed, it was then sent to the Parliament, where the Population Registration Act was amended. Then the Section 54C was inserted to cover our people, and we classified as other Asiatic groups. And on the 1st of February 1961, by the Governor General of the Republic of South Africa, General C.R. Swart. The classification in the other FQF group forced us, or our forebearers, to leave King's Rest, which was now declared an all-white area under the apartheid regime, and moved us to all Indian area in Chatsworth, today known as Chatsworth. At that time, it was known as Zuku Valley, adjoining Silver Glen. As much as we were displaced to the different areas within Durban area, we kept our culture and beliefs and traditions intact, which we still practice up to today. When our fellow Africans from diaspora, those who are Muslims, when they came and settled in Durban to seek employment or citizenship or residence, they had to go and get registered, place called, at that time, Population Register, today is Home Affairs. So when they went there, Population Register will ask them to go to the Bluff and see the head of or the leader of the Zanzibari community, who will give him an approval. Then he would sign that letter and give them, those who are accepted and as migrants, and they would take it to that office where they would be registered as Zanzibaris at that time. And I can positively say that if you look at the Zanzibari community, you'll see a diverse color. You speak the same language. That was done because of the humbleness of my father, who accepted, as long as you were a Muslim, he would accept you into the group at King's Rest. He had a notebook, of course, where he kept a list of all the migrants. So when you go back to the population register, you will get your classification as Zanzibari or Kiwa. When, sadly, I lost my father in 1969, I was still a young man then. I had to assume his responsibility of presenting the recommendation to the population register. And they knew me personally there because they called me to the office. And I would also recommend the people from the diaspora to Home Affairs for them to get citizenship. The Amakuwa community have been in constant battle and struggle to reclaim back our land over the years. That had we were forcibly been removed in the 60s. Of course, I was a small young boy at that time in 62, where these trucks, because we got a classification now, you have to move. I remember the big Leyland trucks of the municipality that was full of sand. It has been loading sand somewhere. And they came there and they said, no, we'll put 1, 2, 5, 6 shacks in one truck, take these people away. Then the white man who came and examined the people's houses and the furniture he saw there, he sent these people back to go and wash those trucks because our people had genuine Mbuya furnitures there. And I remember carefully, vividly, but I can clearly now, those big tables that were made, the first Mbuya sets, with those 3 or double wardrobes. This struggle had come at the end of 2004 when KZN land claims ruled out. Amakuwa community, after the battle and forcibly removed in 1960, in favor of the Amakuwa community, who were rightfully owners of the land in the bluff, the title deed was handed over to us of the 5.2 hectares of land, or 53 hectares of land, which is now prime land estate in the bluff area. Though there was jubilation and celebration in obtaining our land back, the handover process had been daunting and challenging. When trying to reach an agreement with the current landowners. However, our legal team are still trying to pursue this case and claim the land rightfully belonged to us. In the Amakuwa community, and our heritage, it's our history, and lastly, it is our home. 2018-2019, Amakuwa Research Committee arranged a trip to Mozambique. I was present there with a delegation of community members. When we went there, I really saw that hotel, which is in the water, known as Mhipiti. And the reception was very well for us there. And I was privileged, of course, at that time to see where our forefathers were in a dam, which water fills up there, it was empty then. When water fills up, it comes up to your neck. You cannot move when you're in the dam. And there was an entrance and exit into the or the ship where you have to be stuck in there with chains and put into the ship. There's no other exit. So that is where I experienced what my forefathers went through. On tracing the lineage, in fact, with my extended family in Mozambique, I managed to trace my relative there. And my relatives are still in existence. And in Nampula, I've got a family still also living there, whom are related to me personally. It was a humbling moment, though, and I'm grateful to Almighty for that. As an elder and descendant of the original liberated slave, as an elder, today I am proud to and humbled, standing before you to share my part of the rich history. And I also thank for being alive at this age, in a ripe old age. If you want to know, you can ask me, I'll tell you my age. And this celebration of this 150 years with my people, Amakuwa, serves as a history in the making and to last for a time. And it is important for us to realize that at this point in time, Almighty is protecting us still. And I could also mention lots of things which you probably would be interested, and I don't want to take much of the time because time is of essence. My children, I must thank Almighty gave me the strength and the power to educate them. And today, I'm standing here before you because of my children, the encouragement and the dedication and devotion they gave to me to be able to inform my community about this history. And I can sadly say, those who thought otherwise, they have to come back to me and ask me, how did you get all that information? Thank you. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Haji Musa Salim, for that a little bit historical background as to the Makua community and how we came to be here in the port of Natal. Clearly, from what you have said, it looks like our community owes allegiance to our great-great-grandfather, Talib Salim Tunambo, who was able to keep the community register together, as well as the language and the culture of our people. And I think it's important that we acknowledge them even within the history books that we will be writing as a community. Also clearly from what you have said, the displacement and the Group Areas Act as well as apartheid did not deter our community from our resolve. And for this, Nina Shukuruhura, at least as well our Anyati, the whole community together. Pakan lelo Nina lavula lingua, even Achota and as well na havos over. For that, Nina Shukuru Zena. And in terms of the language and culture and the as well as the visit that was taken over, the visit that was conducted, the first visit, official community visit to Mozambique, particularly in Nampula and the island of Mozambique. That was really, really, really important because that's where our identity was able to be cemented. Because looking at the way, from what you have said, the way the Group Areas Act came about and the way there was a whole sense of an identity crisis that the community faced. But with that, and being able to identify exactly where our community comes from, that gave us a sense of belonging. And for that, in shukuru nkuru zena tata. Jazakumullahu khairan. Program director, I need your guidance in terms of time. Okay. Do we proceed? Okay. Program director, Brendan. Do we proceed with the program?
So we just need to juggle the program a bit. We've got some colleagues that have been waiting online for quite some time, and we also want to release them. So, Prof, would you mind to shift you off? So can we step to our online um, contributors?
Hello, is it my turn? Hello? 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 Hello, is it my turn? Is it me now? Hello? Hello? Oops. Hello, can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? Yes? Would you like me to start? Would you like me to? Yes, okay. So I've got a message saying I should start now. Thank you for inviting me to this exciting conference. I've only got a very brief time to talk about the history of the Afro-Sri Lankan communities and their origins. But this conference gave me the opportunity to map out the, to map out the origins of the Afro-Sri Lankans through history, as far as we know. So the historical narratives in the pre-colonial period are scanty, and Africans are mentioned in two instances. The first occurrence is when Ethiopians were trading in the northwestern port of Mantai, which was a major trading port in the Indian Ocean during ancient times. According to the 6th century Greco-Egyptian text, the Christian topography of Cosmos Indico placed us, Habshis, as Ethiopians were called then, traded in Ceylon. So then there's a big gap of 8 centuries, and we learn from Ibn Battuta, the jurist and traveler, the 14th century Moroccan, that the Wazir of Colombo had a force of Habshis in his garrison. And can you, yes, now turning to the colonial era, which began in 1506 and ended in 1948. Galle Fortress, which you see here on the southern coast, was the main entry point for trade and represents the island's triple colonial heritage, Portuguese, Dutch, and British. So Africans were paid salaries by the Portuguese administration, and they budgeted for the cost of food and clothing for African soldiers, and the Portuguese army had 1,000 Africans by 1633. The Gaul Heritage Foundation have erected this monument to enslavement. And as you know, those enslaved were not only Africans, they were also Asians. So the earliest picture painting that we have is from 1662, which you see by a Dutch artist, Esaias Boussy, who served the VOC in Colombo. And these African women are workers in the fortresses. But interestingly, there were a few agateers, prisoners of war, who were in Sri Lanka, who accompanied Boers. And William Snow, aged 39, you see in this picture, was one of them. And the next picture is of Gustav P.A. Martin, a Zulu servant, who was a prisoner with a group of Sapphirs Fontaine. And Gustav served as a servant in the camp and an attendant to other captives. So coming to from that period, the Boer War period, then 1803, Joseph Fernando, who came from Mauritius, and this is only a woodcut of him, he came with a Frenchman called Monsieur Bellicombe, and he is depicted as the executioner of the British Major Davies detachment. So Fernando led an army of Africans to victory and saved the Candian kingdom from falling into British hands. In 1804, the first British governor, Frederick North, whom you see in this picture, purchased Africans from India. He bought 70 men at 175 rix dollars each, and from Goa, and also cheaper from 145 rix dollars from Bombay. He bought 8 women, 79 men, and also he bought from Bombay 2 women and 19 boys. But from Mozambique itself, many were recruited, and I've seen the records in the National Archives in Kew. So the second British governor, Thomas Maitland, was enthusiastic about enlisting Africans. So instead of abolishing slavery during that time, he was recruiting Africans for the British regiments. And even as late as 1810, after abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, he got down 103 African men, 23 women, and 8 children from Diego Garcia. And those slaves were running away from the French. And Maitland welcomed them and injected them to the British Army. But just a few days ago, my colleague in Rhodes University, Dr. Sandy Snell, brought to my attention an example of what we were discussing about, that there could have been servants, African servants, who accompanied Europeans to Sri Lanka. And here is some evidence, because on the 1st of October, 1817, Lieutenant James William Cratwell sought permission for a Hottentot girl called Catherine to accompany him to Ceylon in case of sickness, bad health, or being dismissed in service, with or without good reason. And for this privilege, he offered a handsome sum of money, 100 pounds sterling. But later than that, from 1943 to 44, there were 35,000 East African soldiers, Askaris, who were stationed in Sri Lanka, preparing to attack the Burma front. And they didn't have to go to Burma, they returned back home. But their offspring still live in Sri Lanka. And Catherine Bromber in Berlin has written a book and papers about them. And I also found this postcard of James Mocker, who was labeled as a Sinhalese, a pugilist. He most probably spoke Sinhalese and probably of mixed origin, because in Sri Lanka, mixed marriages were never banned and children assumed the father's ethnicity officially. And now I want to turn to contemporary communities. And I first met this community 22 years ago during my field trip to collect data on the Indo-Portuguese of Ceylon for my doctoral work. And this important lingua franca now survives within a tradition of manja, what this community calls manja. And you're going to hear an example in a few minutes' time. This in-group performance with dance movements by this devout Catholic community shows their layered histories. So typically manja is sung on a Sunday afternoon, because on Sunday morning they attend mass, have lunch, and they get together and they sing manja. So you're going to hear a manja called Ne 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 Koba Jata Yo. If you can play it, please. Oh, you couldn't play it? Okay. So the next slide then is what my colleague Dr. Chapani Mutia helped me to identify as Makua. It's one of the manjas that they sing, which shows their connection to the Makuas. Ma'o akale Makua, amiravo akumi, which means, I gather, mother who is a Makua, the boys are fine. So the community don't speak any African language now, and they have almost completely lost Portuguese, which they still call our language. And they have switched to Sinhala, which is a mother tongue that I share with them. So Manja performance is call and response with polyrhythms, linking them to Africa. And the music begins slowly. At the shout of machete, the singing stops and the dancing begins, and the music gets faster and faster and ends in a melee. So just to conclude, I want to show you that from my research so far, I have found the places of origin to be several. So they've come from Mozambique, Madagascar, Diego Garcia, Mumbai, Goa, Cape Town, Eastern Cape, and Mauritius. And I don't know what anybody, myself or anyone else, will find in the future. So we know the historical archive is incomplete in terms of ethno-linguistic detail, but the silenced histories are broken through cultural production, and the resilience, creativity, and adaptability of these Afro-Sri Lankans are shown through Manja, which reinforces their links with the Imakua people. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Dr. De Silva. I want to just quickly hand to Zaytun Mazia for any thoughts as a discussant, any themes that you picks up. And I think also if we can now pivot to the audience for any questions that you have for the doctor online, please hold those and we'll cross over if you have any questions. Zaytun?
Thank you so much, Dr. Shihan de Silva. I think at the beginning we missed the introduction, and I would just like to quickly introduce just read a bio quickly. Dr. Professor Shihan de Silva is a senior research fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies at the University of London. At the University of Cambridge, she is a dissertation supervisor for Is she gone? Okay.
Can you? I can see myself only. I can't see the chair.
Can you see now?
I can see you now.
Okay. And I think also we thank you for that research, because what you have highlighted here is that the places of origin are really several. You mentioned the Indian Ocean Islands, you mentioned the SADC region, especially Cape Town. So for that, we find that the slave trade has played a pivotal role in displacing communities all over the world, that one would say. And for that, we thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to see if there's any questions for the good Prof before we release her. And this opportunity for the floor, please take it up.
Thank you. Professor, I noticed on your remarks there of the names.
I can't hear the audience or the question. Something about names. Okay. I can still see myself only. I can't see the audience.
You can just text the questions. We'll take a few more. Has been triggered. Please feel free to come in and share with the rest of us.
I'm just one aspect that I'm really keen on. Also had their attendants, a number of them, who also transported with them into prisoner of war camps in Sri Lanka. And I know that there are Boer War graves of the white Boer prisoners. But have you been able to find any graves or any evidence of the Africans that were taken, and whether those graves have any kind of prominence or protection in Sri Lanka? And the quick second part to this is I was very pleased recently in Mpumalanga province, which borders with Mozambique, to find a site of ancient Tamil worship that one historian and archaeologist points to having been there for 1800 years, and showing how people from the southern part of the Asian subcontinent traveled to Mozambique, and the only link with the language of Sri Lanka and southern India is the name of the place, which is today known as Komati Port. And the word Komati is from the Tamil language, because that word is still used in the southern part of India. So I don't know if there's anything that would have crossed over with your research that makes any reference to either the Boer War graves of the attendants or this ancient travel between the southern part of the Asian subcontinent and southeastern Africa. Thank you. Thank you, Brandon.
Your second comment is can you I haven't found any connections from South Asia to Mozambique yet, but the connections that I have seen are from the records of Mozambicans being taken to Sri Lanka in great numbers, like 500 in one go, by the British governors, the first British governor in particular, Frederick North. And as for the graves of Africans, no, and I'm lucky to have seen these two pictures of two Africans printed, published in a book by Richard Brohier. So hope that answers your questions. Because there's very little representation of what Africans looked like. You know, they are normally mentioned in numbers: 100 soldiers, 300 African soldiers. They're anonymous. I mean, Joseph Fernando in 1803 is unusual to have a woodcut of him, and otherwise we only have the Dutchman's pictures of who served for the VOC during the Dutch times, and that's the first picture we have of Africans.
Good day, doctor. Could I go ahead? You mentioned Can you hear me?
I can hear you now, but I didn't hear your question before.
Okay, fine. My question is, there was a prohibition on mixed marriages. I want to know if there's any other prohibition in terms of where they lived or where they stayed or what they've done or what they do on a daily basis, or how did they manage to preserve their identity as such? Thank you.
Okay, so in Sri Lanka, there was no prohibition on mixed marriages. So much so that when the British took over from the Dutch, the secretary of the governor wrote that of the 9,000 or so Africans that lived during the Dutch times, that he couldn't identify them as being African because they had outmarried from the start. So we didn't have any prohibitions of outmarriage. But officially, the father's ethnicity is what the child assumes now. So there are many more Africans, Afro descendants, than the official statistics would show. And people identify with one ethnic group or another when they are small families, you know, living among other communities, or they identify with the majority in the area. Is that what you meant?
Themes of and also the invisibility of the African descendants to the colonial authorities, being mentioned as numbers, not by names, few images, and so the historical record is very scant. So if we can jot that down, some of our rapporteurs, so they can just pull these out and filter them into the Amakuwa Research Committee. So I want to keep the program flowing. If there's no more questions, I'm going to call upon Professor Carlson to please come up. Zaitun will give his credentials and then we'll get his presentation. Thank you so much. Please, can you ready Prof's PowerPoint for us? We're good. Thank you so much.
Okay. Just to introduce Professor Preben. Professor Preben Karshom is a Professor Emeritus of Global and International Development Studies at Roskilde University in Denmark and a member of the Scientific Advisory Board for the Intercontinental Slavery Museum in Port Louis, Mauritius. His research interests focus on the Indian Ocean, transnational Islamic movements, the history of forms of unfree labor and global varieties of urban informality. He has a long history of collaboration with the Amakuwa Research Committee and has published articles about the Durban Zanzibaris in the Journal of African History, the Journal of Southern African Studies, as well as Social Dynamics, the Journal of Eastern African Studies, and the Aprovasi Ghat, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing correctly, Trust Magazine. It's a great honor and privilege to be introducing Professor Preben. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zaitun, and thank you, everybody. I'm very happy and very proud to be here and very happy to have been invited. It's a great pleasure that things have come this far and that to have this wonderful celebration. So I'm going to speak about Islam and self-identification of Makua diasporas in different African societies. And I want to start by saying the Indian Ocean slave trade in the 18th and 19th centuries was a very different thing from the Atlantic slave trade. So we often, when we think of the slave trade, we think of an Atlantic trade of sort of big ships carrying hundreds of ships across from Africa to plantation economies in the Americas mostly, and then being linked with a triangular trade in sugar and plantation products going back to Europe. And there was a bit of that in the Indian Ocean also, and the Indian Ocean slave trade was linked to the Atlantic trade in many ways, and ships from northern Mozambique, from Ilya, would go to Cape Town, and from Cape Town into the Atlantic. So Makua slaves were also, transported into the Atlantic. But mostly the Indian Ocean slave trade was a very different kind of thing and took place in much smaller batches and along a much more diverse in slave ships and in dhows being taken across. So Makua identity was something that was formed by people taken as slaves in very different surroundings and coming together through the common experience of enslavement and transportation. So of the first batches of Zanzibaris arriving in, of the 5 batches of Zanzibaris arriving in Durban between 1873 and 1877, the first 3 groups were taken from dhows that were setting off from the northern Mozambique, heading for Madagascar, while the last 2 batches were freed from dhows that were traveling from the Tanzanian mainland coast to the island of Pemba, where slavery and slave trade was still allowed after 1873, when it was prohibited in Unguja. So many of these, probably most of these slaves in the second batches were therefore Ngindu or Yao speakers. And some of them may even have been slaves in Zanzibar before they were taken as slaves on the Tanzanian coast and then transported and intercepted by British ships and sent either through Zanzibar or directly to Durban. So, so all these 5 groups became Amakuwa through their common trajectories and experiences of enslavement, abolition, and servitude. So Makua identity was something that was created in a dynamic historical process rather than something that existed as a firm and homogeneous thing in a particular place. So at their points of arrival, these groups of Makua-speaking former slaves became part of local society in very different ways also. And the Durban Zanzibaris, as we know, developed in different directions as they came to interact with Catholic and Muslim philanthropies and educational establishments, respectively, as we also heard this morning. So while, to simplify, while Christian missions encouraged a farewell to traditions and cultural traditions and an integration into a broader Zulu-speaking African society, the Zanzibaris were supported by Indian Muslim endowments in Durban to preserve and develop their cultural and linguistic uniqueness, which they had carried with them from their original background societies along the African coast. At the same time, Sufi Tariqa network connections with northern Mozambique through Maputo continued to exist right from the 1870s into the 20th century and provided an important framework for the persistence and maintenance of links with Makua-speaking societies in Ilha de Mozambique, in Mosuril, in Nampula, in Angoche, and so on, and Durban. This was also a particularly open-minded and inclusive religious environment, which allowed for the incorporation into Zanzibari society of new members, of new Muslim members with an Indian background or a Malawian background. So this Makua identity also developed as Zanzibaris into a more inclusive form of community, which added into new groups to become incorporated into this Makua-speaking community. So the self-identification of the community as Zanzibari, I think, reflected its openness and inclusivity. And it also served the community well as a strategic resource through a South African history of segregation and apartheid, which made it possible for the, I mean, even if there was forced removal as a traumatic experience from King's Rest, Chatsworth and becoming part of this other Asiatics classification also involved important benefits in the form of access to Indian health services, Indian educational establishments, and so on, from which Zanzibari youngsters and children were benefiting. But my main point is that Islam has been a major factor in keeping Makua society in Durban together and preserving its language. And this is in contrast with other of these diasporic environments I was mentioning in Madagascar or Mauritius, for instance, where descendants of Makua-speaking slaves and liberated Africans have mostly lost their language and cultural distinction, and has done so not least due to the impact and influence of them on from Christian missions and an absence of mostly of a Muslim environment into which they could integrate. So I think there are great prospects for research and activity in networking among these diasporic Makua societies and promoting interaction between them. And I think the Durban Zanzibaris and Amakuwa in many ways can serve as a role model for other diasporic societies, as it has indeed done within Durban and within South Africa already. But I think it's important to see notions of home and origin as narratives and of something that has developed historically, and to see notions of both Amakuwa and Zanzibari identity as having been important for this dynamic and creative process of historical construction. So, yeah, I just wanted to show, to conclude, a few photos of the early Amakuwa Research Committee members visiting Zanzibar in 2011. So you will see some of the elders which are no longer with us, but who came along on this trip and who were very much excited about visiting Zanzibar, also as an environment which had been important for them, and which, of course, also was an important place to go to for the Sufi, for the Kadiriya and Shadiliya networks, and where Qadis and institutions had their homes which could settle disputes within these frameworks. So I think so Zanzibar was an important place of orientation for the community, no matter whether they saw themselves as Zanzibaris or Amakuwa or as both. So maybe we can just skip through these photos and let us conclude in that way. So here we have Yusuf Abdul Rahman, Salim Rapenda, and Eddie Osman visiting a mosque in southern Zanzibar. And here they are visiting a library for the Kadiriya Tariqa in Zanzibar also. And there's Alpha also visiting the same place and studying their collections. And what else? Do we have more? Yeah. And here also this Zanzibari learned Sufi scholar sharing and discussing documents with his visitors from Durban. So thank you very much. Let me conclude in this way, and thank you for your patience.
Family, I think we've got, if there's any questions or comments or responses that have been triggered or evoked by this wonderful presentation, you're free to jump in. And then we got one more quick presentation, then we're done for this session. It's a bit of a long one, so bear with me. Sorry.
Thank you, Prof. Good day. I really enjoyed your presentation. My question is, it bears on the particular issue of where most of the diaspora have lost their language skills in the Makua. How do we really identify them as Makua? Are there other factors that you take into account since they've lost their language skills in the language of Makua?
So how do we know they were Makua in the first place, or why can we call them Makua?
Yeah.
But I mean, through to some of the same archival documentation, for instance, as we have for the Makua Society in Durban. I mean, we have these important registers from the 1870s of these liberated Africans who give their names and the dates of the ships, names and dates of the ships of arrival, and we know that's something Professor Abdul Sharif has worked on from Zanzibar archives and elsewhere, where the routes of these ships, where they were traveling and where they were picking up slaves. So we know that, I mean, the slaves who were taken off the coast of Madagascar came very definitely from, were shipped in dhows that were traveling from an area around Mukambo Bay, Kivulani and Umfusi, on the coast just between Ilya and Angosh. So we don't know whether they actually. So some of them were probably people who had their homes there and villages there, but other slaves among them might have actually been walked a long way in caravans to get there. So we know where they were sent from as slaves, and know there was slave raiding going on in that area. So that makes it very likely and probable that they were Makua speakers from there. And also, I mean, that's one thing that people can identify today from the language of the Durban Makua speakers, that this Makua is close to Nahara, which is the sort of language spoken around Ilya and in some cases, and in other cases that of Koti, the language of Angosh, which is a bit more complicated because the Koti speakers were also slave traders in some cases and would distinguish themselves from as Koti from Makuas who the people they called Makuas were people they saw as slaves. So there are all sorts of interesting things there. But in Mauritius and Madagascar, you also have registers of slaves and registers of liberated Africans who list their background and where you can sort of deduct things in a similar. Sometimes they're often listed as Makua, but also they're just listed as Mozambique. And Makua is also sometimes used as a synonym for Mozambique. And the people who made the registers often didn't know, anything about the background. So it's not very reliable source material, but you can still learn insights from it.
Okay, thank you very much for that response. The other question I might need to ask is, whether in their present form today, do they have some mannerism or some culturalism that links this group together by some means or something, some bearing, it manifests or some rituals, if there's any?
Yeah, I think Clara Boyera Rosol, who will speak later, I mean, she has been involved with one particular group of Makua speakers in Mauritius, or people of Makua background, who only have retained very little of their Makua language, but who call them, who all have Lily as their last name. But Lily is the name of the ship on which they were brought from from Mozambique to Mauritius. So that again sort of confirms the point that the shared identity was formed through this experience of enslavement. And so Clara has, but she will probably talk about that, has worked with this group, and they've been very happy, to explore and get together around a common history. And I think in Madagascar, there are a few similar activities also, as well as many other new inventions of of being Makua in a smart way. So there are modern notions of being Makua also in Madagascar that are very interesting.
Any more questions? Prof, one more for you.
Good day, Prof. My name is Anissa Aisha Salaman. Earlier, you mentioned something about the Amakuwa identity had to be created, right? You said it was created based on circumstances, and it also included different African ethnicities from the diaspora. So is there any evidence of this? And if you could kindly elaborate more on this. Thank you.
Yeah, but I think the evidence is, I mean, as well as from these dhows that were traveling from northern Mozambique towards Madagascar and intercepted by British ships there are similar evidence about the ships traveling from the Tanzanian coast to Pemba and intercepted there. So in a similar way, we know about where those people would have come from. But we also know that after 1873, when the slave trade is abolished in Unguja, in the main island of Zanzibar, people are walked for long, because slaves that were meant to have gone to the Zanzibar slave market could now not be sold there. So then they were marched along the coast a long way to be taken to Pemba instead, where there still was a slave market. But I mean, but in the same, but it's I think very few of those people, maybe some of them, but only a minority of them would have been Makua speakers before they were taken as slaves, and the majority would have been Ngindu and maybe Yao speakers, and then coming together with these Makua, and Makua becoming this kind of lingua franca among slaves, in a sense that made it possible for them to communicate and establish a common culture and community between them. They became community speakers, but not necessarily losing their other language also. And I think also in the Durban Zanzibari Amakuwa community, there have been Yao speakers. There are probably still Yao speakers and Swahili people, who in their language competence today reflect this history of a complex background. So I think that's it's something. I mean, Sarifa Mula has, I think, will maybe also talk about, and which she writes about in her very interesting PhD dissertation.
Yes, thank you. Prof, how did the Zanzibari or Amakuwa community in Durban transcend ethnically defined boundaries, and what role did the openness and inclusion fostered by the traditions of Sufi Islam play in this?
But I think the Sufi Islam played a tremendously important role, because, I mean, Islam, other Islamic traditions were also very exclusive in terms of distinguishing, seeing Muslim Islam as a religion that was not for slaves, and only non-Muslims could be enslaved and so on. But I think from the late 19th century, we get these Kadiriya, Shaduliya, Rifaya networks moving down along the coast and becoming very important for the inclusion of slaves and liberated slaves into a common community and society. And I think that openness also uh, extends to other languages and ethnicities, if you like, so that so I think that has been tremendously important, but and which is something one should study more specifically in different contexts. But there's quite a lot of work on it in I think also in Zanzibar and in Mozambique, where because Indian Ocean slavery is also a more complex thing in the sense that in many places it did not involve a very absolute distinction between what it meant to be a slave and be a non-slave. And there were different kinds of slavery. And some forms of slavery were even temporary, so that, and that's where indentured labor could be said to resemble slavery. And people, there were even in some cases in northern Mozambique slave labor contracts, which stipulated that this particular slave could only be used for domestic work and could not be sold into trade that would take him or her out of Mozambique, and so not be sold to the Portuguese or Brazilian ships that were carrying ships through Cape Town to the Americas. So
we need to move the program along because we've got one more presenter online, Dr. Carla Buyol Rasul. Is she available online? And if Zaitun can, she's there. Excellent. She's joining us now.
Do you hear me?
Welcome.
Thank you.
Guys, can we?
Do you hear me? I do not have a response.
Excellent.
Do you hear me? Ah.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, the connection is not very good. I do not see you all the time.
So, ready your presentation. Prof, you can begin to project your slides if you have any.
Non. Attends. Comment on fait? Diapo. Votre ordinateur. Porter un fichier.
Late for the session. What?
It doesn't work. Someone could please show the PowerPoint because I sent it.
Maman.
Oh là là.
Maman.
Our attention.
Do you see the presentation? Do you see the presentation scrolling?
Yeah.
Someone can tell me if you can see the presentation. Okay, great. So I start. I thank you very much. So I did my thesis on the Makua in Madagascar, but today I would like to present you my new research on the Mozambique diaspora in the Mascarene Islands, the La Réunion and Mauritius. Eugène Huet de Froberville was an ethnographer born in Mauritius in 1815. He conducted an important study on East Africa, people and languages. He never went into the African continent himself, but he collected various information and testimonies among East Africans who were deported as captives to the Mascarene. Between 1845 and 1847, he interviewed over than 300 East African ex-captives in La Réunion and Mauritius. They came from diverse regions we can localize in present-day Mozambique, Tanzania, and Malawi. Froberville distinguished 31 East African linguistical groups among the Africans he interviewed, including the Makua. So Eugène de Froberville took extensive field notes, but his manuscripts were not accessible to researchers, and I was enough lucky to access these amazing archives, private archives in France a few years ago. Based on a corpus of over 2,000 pages, I was able to identify 140 individuals out of the 300 East Africans Froberville interviewed in the Mascarene Islands. For each of these 140 individuals, it was possible to retrace their names, origins, life trajectories, cultural practice, etc. 20 identified informants were from Makua linguistical and cultural group and were born in present-day North Mozambique. While the Makua interviewed by Froberville in December 1845 in the French colony of Bourbon, La Réunion, were still enslaved, in the British colony of Mauritius, slavery has been abolished some 10 years earlier. The majority of these 140 individuals I identified were deported during the illegal slave trade between the 1810s and 1830s in the Mascarene. Some were Africans liberated who were introduced in Mauritius in 1840. The faces of some of these African-born have been molded by Eugène de Froberville. In 1846, Eugène de Froberville produced a collection of 63 plaster casts molded on the faces of African-born in Mauritius. In all, 58 individuals were casted, among them 10 were Makua. Here is an example of one of these African-born individual molded and interviewed by Eugène de Froberville, Kurunua, who was renamed Zéphirin in Mauritius, and he was from Makua group born in North Mozambique. This collection of plaster casts of Froberville, the original collection, I was able to find it in a museum in France. Thanks to the notebooks of Eugène de Froberville, I was able to reconstruct life stories of these individuals, such as Kurunua, and I transcribed in the first person this life story. Here in Mauritius, I was named Zephyrin, but in my homeland, my name was Kurunua. I was born around 1796 in Amakuwa country, north of present-day Mozambique. My homeland was crossed by the Mulela River in a region on the Mozambique coast north of Keliman, between the Likungo and Lingonia rivers. I was about 12 or 13 years old when I was deported from Mozambique to Mauritius, where I remained for 25 years in slavery. In Mauritius, I was baptized with the name of Zephyrin. 10 years after the abolition of slavery in 1846, I was working in Port Louis for Monsieur Henri Adam, a merchant with whom the Froberville stayed when they arrived in Mauritius in December 1845. I was about 50 years old in 1846 when Froberville asked me about my country of origin and molded my face with plaster. So there is also a lithographic portrait of Kurunua on which we can see his tattoos. And Froberville described these tattoos as typical for the Amakuwa of North Mozambique. And we can see that Kurunua wore his hair shaved on the sides with a slight tassel on the top of his head. And it was a hairstyle much appreciated by the Amakuwa. Even though he was deported to Mauritius at a very young age, Kurunua retained the cultural practices of his homeland, as well as the memory of the Amakuwa languages, music, dances. And for example, Froberville transcribed several Amakuwa musical score on his notebooks. Here is a musical score transmitted by Kurunua himself, but there are several more Amakuwa music scores transcribed by Froberville in his notebooks. He also drowned Amakuwa musician. He observed in Mauritius and La Réunion. So this is very interesting because it showed that they kept their cultures in the situation of slavery or post-slavery in these colonial societies of La Réunion and Mauritius. Here is a Amakuwa instrument, the chirimbo. Here, Amakuwa dancer. Here is another example of a Amakuwa born, interviewed and molded by Froberville in 1846 in Mauritius. His name was Kupeliua, and he was renamed Charles Lily. Kupeliua was born around 1820 in the Amakuwa Witugulu country. You know that this Amakuwa country is, as you can see in this map reconstructed by Froberville, this region is in the hinterland west to Mozambique Island. Kupeliua. So he was born in the Amakuwa country. And here is a copy of his face plaster cast on which you can see his tattoos on the forehead. And here is other drawings of Eugène de Froberville of the tattoos of the Amakuwa he observed in Mauritius and La Réunion. And also the felt teeth of the Amakuwa. So in Keliman, Kupeliua has been embarked in May 1840 with 550 other captives aboard the Brazilian slave ship the José. Shortly after leaving the mouth of the Zambezi River, the José was pursued by the English ship the Lily. There was panic about the José, which ran ashore and was smashed to pieces. Kupeleua stayed on board with 323 other captives. They were loaded aboard the Lily and taken to Mauritius. During the crossing of the sea, 59 of these African liberated died of disease. Arriving in Pearl Harbor in June 1840, some 65 survivors were aboard the Lily. In Port Louis, Kupeleua was renamed Charles Lily and was probably hired as a servant in town. 6 years after his arrival in 1846, he was interviewed and mauled by Eugène de Froberville in Port Louis. In 1851, some liberated from the Lily petitioned the colonial authorities in Mauritius to return to Keliman on the Mozambique coast. The English colonial authorities dissuaded them from returning to Mozambique. As a result, they had to remain in Mauritius, where the descendants continued to bear the name of the ship, the Lily, as their family name. And a few months ago, I was enough lucky to meet some descendants of African liberated from the Lily, and they have still this name Lily as their family name. For example, David Lily, at the top of the left of this picture, he said to me, "As long as we do not know the name of our ancestor who came in Mauritius on board of the Lily, all those who came on the Lily are our ancestors." The East African ancestors in the Mascareign, including the Amakuwa ancestors, were also the faces and the voices of the Mozambique diaspora in the Indian Ocean that also can be found in the Atlantic. Their history creates a bridge between the two oceans. So, do you see me? Now, I have finished my presentation.
I think we've come to the end. That's an opportune pause with technology saving us. We weren't going to take any questions due to time. And if you do have any questions, this young lady will take them and text them through to Dr. Rasul, and we'll get the feedback because we don't want to lose the insights and your contributions. So what I'm going to do now is just have from the floor and not through the broadcast. If there's any contributions or triggers or insights that we have, I know that there was a gentleman that caught me. He's now on his phone. He wants to make a contribution, but I think we can take 2 or 3 before we break for something to eat. Are we running out of steam and attention span? Okay, so I think, guys, it's opportune that we can always begin the next session with some contributions. But I think we now completed with panel 1. And thank you to all of the contributors to panel 1, to my discussants. You did very well, very insightful. To all the presenters, quality work and excellent presentations. To you, the audience, thank you for your attention. I think we can break and just have a body break and something to eat. Thank you so much.
Africa.